as we talk about how we collect data and the populations and the things that we wish to study, it's important to think about our sources for data. So you as a student may be collecting data physically in your statistical studies that you design in your specific field of interest. But you may also be collecting data that has been collected by somebody else. And if you think about it in terms of how we collect information about the world we live in and information about the society that we live in other words, how we consume media, then there's a balance that we should consider in terms of what our sources, if they're giving us representative data, and if we can trust the data that they're giving us. So this should be paired in conjunction with other analyses of how we consume media. This is coming from a statistical point of view. But the idea is that we have three pillars of how we should evaluate our sources. The first being reputability. A source is reputable if organizations and individuals come to this source for data for the purposes that you seek. So in common English, what this means is, if you're studying, for instance, politics, or if you are yourself someone working in politics, do other people and organizations come to this source to get information about politics like you are? And that's a very specific example, but it does overlap a lot with media. And so I have this picture from this chart, from Media's bias chart. This is from 2018, so it's a little dated, but this is a graphic organizer that has a sample of a lot of different media outlets and evaluates them for the quality of the content that they produce, as well as their partisan bias. Where reputability falls in is that if other people are linking to these websites and publications, then that typically means, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, but that typically means that they're reputable. And that goes in conjunction with the other three pillars. But if you'll notice in this green, so there's a green bar here, these groups of media outlets are linked to by other media outlets. And these typically feature original fact reporting or just basic fact reporting, which means that these reporters are going out there and collecting the data and getting information themselves, typically. And that's what makes them reputable. On the other hand, we should consider the transparency of a source. So your data that you're collecting from this media outlet or any sort of data source, do they disclose how they obtain their data, their funding, and any relevant affiliations? So where that comes in terms of this chart is some of these outlets, they get their funding from, they may get personal contributions from people, or they may get funding from organizations, think tanks, and other organizations that have a specific objective in the information that they want to put out there, right? So, for instance, something like Occupy Democrats receives funding from special interest groups that want to promote a liberal partisan bias. Other groups, such as Newsmax, for instance, receive a lot of funding from right-wing organizations. And so whether that they disclose that and are transparent about that is what goes into this pillar that we call transparency. And that doesn't mean that it's bad that somebody receives money from someone necessarily, but they should be upfront about it. Lastly, if a source is evidential, that means that their claims are supported by clear and understandable figures and tables, and if necessary, raw data. You'll have in this yellow box, for instance, which is denoted in terms of this graphic as supposedly not as good as the media outlets in the green box, but they often perform analysis on the fact reporting that is actually reasonable and evidential. So it is based on fact, and they usually provide links to those facts themselves, even if they can be leaning more on opinion and partisan analysis of that fact reporting. When you have all three of these, you can reasonably conclude that your source is a good source for your data. And even though this is specifically in terms of media outlets, this actually applies to a lot of different data sources. So always keep these things in mind when you are collecting your data from a secondary source. Other questions that you should ask yourself are, especially if you're considering a source that is performing analysis, does the conclusion follow from the evidence? So they may be providing your raw data, figures, but does the conclusion, is it logically sound to follow your evidence to the conclusion? And this goes into a later section, but do the sampling methods introduce error? So if your, for instance, reason.com article is citing a poll or a voluntary response sample that is obviously highly skewed toward a specific kind of audience, that may be introducing some error. And lastly, there's two more questions. Who benefits from this study? This question is actually really important in terms of some of the information that's out there about climate science in particular, because some industry leaders, such as ExxonMobil, are notorious for funding climate science skeptical research. So think about when you're reading your studies and seeing who's collecting your data, who is benefiting from this? Okay, now for serious. Lastly, was the context of the study properly considered? Let's unpack this. What this means is, if a study is performed under suboptimal conditions, maybe their conclusions aren't drawn properly. As an example, if we were talking about childcare and concerns about childhood development, anything published within the last year may be ignoring impacts from, you guessed it, the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So whatever situation or paradigm we're living in may be influencing the specific circumstances of that study. So that's a good question to consider.